Life Squared, a novel written by and read by George Trombley. Chapter 4. George. George had continued watching the news daily. There was a lot of talk about space elevators and how it was the new space race. When George met Kim that Wednesday at George's favorite taco stand, they discussed the latest conspiracy theory that China was secretly building 10 space elevators instead of just 2. After some debate, Kim agreed that there was no advantage to hiding a space elevator. George started conversations about a few other interesting news items that he had seen, and Kim seemed quite happy. After George finished his tacos, he got refills for their drinks. Once back at the table, Kim spoke. "You know, I could only find one article about that Square Puppenmacher guy." "Oh yeah?" George asked. "Yeah, he won some sort of debate contest in college, but nothing before and nothing after that comes up. Even when I cross-reference his first name, last name, and various misspellings, I find nothing." George wondered out loud. Maybe he values his privacy. George didn't do social media. After his MMA career ended so abruptly, and in his mind embarrassingly, he spent hours sending removal requests to MMA sites and fan blogs using the new privacy laws to wipe his entire MMA history. Of course, there were limits to what he could erase, because data that intertwined with other people, such as videos of his fights and fight roster data, weren't subject to DPRA protections. "He reminds me of someone I know. Maybe he's your twin," Kim teased. "You think I have visions of grandeur, saving mankind?" George said, half seriously. "You never know what the future has in store for you," Kim said, taking the last bite of her taco. With a full mouth, she said, "Maybe Square isn't his real name." "What do you mean?" George asked. "Well, that's the only thing that makes sense. I've done tons of scrub jobs for my clients, but Square is cleaner than any client I've ever scrubbed. And that's after extensive scrubbing." George thought of his last 2 sessions with Square. He doesn't seem like the kind of guy to enable omnipresence mode. I think he even said something about not being fond of opium. Kim took a gulp of her soft drink. "The DPRA makes it easier to be hidden, but it's not perfect. Not every country believes in a right to privacy, and there are underground groups that swap data on private boards. It's just practically impossible to be this clean. I need you to get me more identifiers, like maybe his real name?" George was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable. "Kim, you know how I feel about this topic. If a man wants to be private, let him be private. It is his right after all. Can we just drop the investigation so I can enjoy being Mr. Moneybags for a bit?" George braced for an emotional response from Kim, but Kim smiled softly. Okay. It's the least I can do now that you're actually watching the news. I'll hold off for you. You just promise to let me know if you get more information or anything seems weird." "Ah, it's already weird," George said as he finished off his drink. Chapter 5. George. It was Thursday again. George hadn't heard anything from Square during the week. It either meant that Square had no problems doing the in-between sessions on his own, or, like most people, he found ways to justify not doing any sessions at all. George exited the East 2 elevator and saw the equipment he had requested in a roped-off area on the left. On the table near the guest seats were 2 bottles of Shizen green tea, with a glass freshly filled with ice. Omni spoke. "Mr. Puppenmacher is running a few minutes late. We are sorry for the inconvenience." Why does this feel like déjà vu? "I see. Thanks for the tea." "You can thank Omni Scheduler for scheduling the staff from the cafeteria for the tea," Omni replied. George walked over and inspected the equipment with a bottle of Shizen in his hand. "You can tell the staff I don't need ice. I don't like the tea watered down." "Noted." George began setting tension and changing pin locations for the weight load he felt Square could handle. He made notes on Square's profile of each of the weight settings. 10 minutes had passed and Square still hadn't shown up. George took a final swig of his tea. "Well, is he coming or not?" "I have only been informed that he will be a few minutes late. Perhaps you would like another tea?" Omni asked. "Sure," George said as he walked towards the guest seats. He was sure the mannequins weren't the same ones from last week. The mannequin standing nearest the guest chairs now had natural brown hair and was a few inches shorter than the first mannequin George examined. It appeared to have a 2-day beard stubble. George rubbed the back of his hand up the mannequin's cheek, then compared it to his own beard stubble. It felt identical. How do they do this? George asked Omni. Omni surprised George by not having an answer. I'm not sure. You're not sure? Aren't you an all-knowing AI? George teased, then immediately thought Omni probably didn't understand teasing. I'm not all-knowing. My access to information is limited in some cases. All information related to the Life Extension Program is limited in my programming. Did Omni just slip up? This was the first George had heard of the Life Extension Project. Even Kim, with all of her deep digging into Letter, hadn't mentioned it. The doors of the South 2 elevator opened, and Square stepped out. I see you've seen our latest upgrades. It's quite amazing, isn't it? George agreed. I've never seen anything like it. Don't forget, you've signed an NDA with Letter. Anything you learn during our sessions or that I tell you must remain confidential, Square reminded him. Yeah, I remember. Maybe you should tell me what they are, so I have something not to tell anyone, George said. What do you think they are? Square asked. They look like mannequins, but this level of design would be wasted on a mannequin selling shorts at the mall. My guess would be that they're a new type of sex doll, George said seriously. George heard Square belly laugh for the first time. Each time Square got close to gaining his composure, he seemed to remember the words George said and began to laugh again. After a few minutes, Square was composed enough to speak. I'm surprised no one on the team has ever suggested this. It would be a hit for sure. Certainly, they have all the parts. George had enjoyed Square's belly laugh, although it wasn't intentional. He figured he would go for one more laugh. With all the brain power you seem to have here at Omni, and hundreds of people on Floor 92, I'm surprised one of these mannequins with all their parts, as you say, haven't filed a sexual harassment suit. Square smiled, almost breaking into a laugh again. That's clever, George. Thank you for lightening the mood. I sometimes forget I'm human with all these mannequins staring at me. George smiled. I'm honestly not much of a joke teller, but I'm trying to be more engaging. The more I learn about you, the more I like. How about we have lunch after today's session? I've been to most places around here, more times than I can count. So you decide the place, and I'll treat. George didn't have plans until later with Kim. All right. The place won't be fancy, but it'll be tasty, George said. I'm fine as long as it isn't vegan or anything else healthy. And if they have chocolate shakes, it'll be even better, Square said with a slight chuckle. You might want to curb your sugar intake, although it's fine immediately after our workout, George advised him. Look, I grew up as my mother's lab rat. She read an article from some obscure health blog, and next thing you know, I'm eating carrot soup for 3 days. Once I left home, I decided I would never eat healthy again. I eat what I want, when I want, Square said firmly. While I appreciate your conviction, Square, I'm not sure you can live forever like you want to without paying attention to diet. What if I told you that isn't true and that people can live forever? Square asked. I'd think I'd be out of a job soon if that was true. Square smiled. George, do you know what letter stands for? I don't. He wondered if Kim didn't either, since she hadn't mentioned it. It's not public information. Our critics joke that it stands for large, evil, totally reckless, and some think it's a fancy shortened version of the word letter, Square said. I hadn't given it much thought. Square looked up towards the ceiling. Letter? Disabled until 2 p.m. Understood, Omni responded. Square turned back to George. It stands for Life Extension Through Robotics. Life extension? George prompted. Yes. One day in the near future, those mannequins will be the savior of mankind. People that are paralyzed in accidents or by disease will no longer be trapped. Elderly people with bodies that have grown weak or old will no longer have to wither away. So you see, it doesn't matter if I eat healthy or injure this body, because long before my death, we will have perfected the science, and I will transfer into a new body. George was genuinely taken aback by Square's words. He wasn't sure how to wrap his head around this new information. That's amazing, but how is that even possible? Just because something isn't possible today doesn't mean it won't be possible tomorrow. In fact, consider this. Absolutely everything created by mankind, every technology, every book, every skyscraper, without exception, starts out as a colorless, weightless, invisible thought in the mind of a human. Humans are essentially able to create something from nothing. The logic was sound. Are Square's delusions actually genius thoughts? Certainly, it won't be easy to move into a new body, George said. You're not wrong. There are hundreds of trillions of connections in the human body. The nervous system alone makes up 7 trillion of those connections. So indeed, it seems impossible to the unknowing. But the Human Genome Project also set out to do what was at the time thought impossible. Yet, in less than 2 decades, they had sequenced the entire human genome. So, these mannequins, are they alive? They are organic, but they aren't alive. We know how to control the body through electrical impulses, but we don't have the ability to create a conscious being. Even as real as Omni can sound, it's merely an interface making millions of calculations. Think of the mannequins as an intricate interface to the mind, Square said. So, this is your plan to save mankind? George asked. It's not just my plan. I'm one of many working on the project. I believe I have unique knowledge that only I can bring to the project. I'm kind of the chief architect. Square's anatomy knowledge, his desire to break his body by pushing it to his limits, all made sense to George now. Perhaps I misjudged you, George said. We'll find out, Square said as he chuckled. George realized it was already half past the hour. Well then, let's get started. Square liked this response. Thanks for keeping me on track. He began pulling off his clothing as he walked towards his desk. I've been told I'm a bit wordy, he said while stripping naked and pulling a fresh set of matching indigo blue shorts and shirt from his desk. The shorts had a white triangle logo on the left leg. George froze. Square's shorts were identical to the ones he wore that fateful night. Even the triangle logo was an exact match. A flashback to his final MMA fight rushed into his mind. Are you okay, George? Square said with a concerned look on his face. George swallowed hard. I just need a minute. Sure, Square said. George turned away from Square and walked toward the west windows. His heart was racing, and sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead. Romero was on the mat looking up at George, and in slow motion the bottom of Romero's foot sliced through the air towards George's knee. Back in Square's office, George flinched and his knee felt weakened. George took a deep breath and closed his eyes, remembering something his psychiatrist had quoted him by J.M. Coetzee when George was in his darkest moment. Fate deals you a hand, and you play the hand you are dealt. You do not whine, and you do not complain. There was more to the quote, but the psychiatrist had changed it to something more positive. He added, Instead, you drive to a height so high, even fate can't knock you down again. George felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Square's. If you want to do another day, I can rearrange my schedule. George snapped out of his momentary lapse to darker days. No, I'm fine. My knee was just acting up. It does it from time to time. But it's okay now. Let's get to the workout. The workout began with another session of push-ups. Square did as many push-ups as he could until he could do no more. George hadn't asked, but it was obvious Square had done the additional workout sessions required of him throughout the week. During the first session, Square had only been able to do 18 push-ups. Now he did 26 without a rest, followed by 5 more after a 10-second break. It was impressive progress for a man his age. In Square's profile, George made notes of each exercise he completed on the new machines. After running 5 laps around the perimeter of the spacious office, George ended the session. Square was drenched in sweat. Let me shower and I'll be right back down so we can get that lunch. Where are we going, by the way? He asked. It's a place called Locos Tacos, George said. Great. I've yet to go there. He excused himself to take a shower on the 101st floor. George sat in one of the guest seats. Trying to forget earlier, he pulled out his phone and started quietly reading In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. It was his third time reading the classic true crime book. After a few minutes, the East 2 elevator doors popped. George expected Square, even though Square had left on the South 2 elevator. It was a woman George hadn't seen before. She had orange-red hair up in a bun, and as she got closer, he saw her face was covered in freckles. She was accompanied by 2 other male staff. One was pushing a flat hand truck with 2 mannequins sitting one behind the other as if they were at the top of a snowy hill waiting to slide down. "I thought you'd be here," she said as she pushed the hand truck towards where George was sitting. George stood up. "Oh, I don't think we've met. I'm George." "I know who you are. You've come up in 1 or 2 of our meetings," she said. "I did?" "Of course you did. Square is very careful about who he brings into his inner circle." George hadn't heard that he was part of any inner circle. "Anyways, I'm Alani," she said, extending her hand for a handshake. Her hand was warm and soft, quite different from Square's post-session clammy hand. "Alani. Does everyone working at Letter have an interesting name?" George said with a smile. "It's not that interesting. It just means orange tree in Hawaiian. My mother originally was going to name me Kanani, which means the beauty, but once she saw my red hair, she thought Alani was more appropriate." George thought both names fit her well, but not wanting to make her feel uncomfortable, he kept the thought to himself. "So you're in charge of changing out the mannequins," George said. "Among many other things, including running all types of errands for Square," she smiled, "even though my job description says I should be primarily involved with biology tasks." Alani directed the 2 men to replace the mannequins, and George asked, "You change these quite a bit, it seems." "We do. It's best to change them twice a day. Besides, the team's constantly making tweaks and updates. Square and Shania are always improving the internal connections." "I'm guessing you can't do over-the-air updates?" George asked. "These aren't mechanical. Even if they were, you can't make physical changes over the air now, can you?" "I guess not," George agreed. "I'm impressed that you even thought to ask about over-the-air updates. You seem to know a lot for a physical trainer," Alani said. "I read a lot." George held up his phone showing the cover of In Cold Blood. George could tell by the men's breathing and the way that they lifted the mannequins that they were quite heavy. They moved both of the older mannequins into standing positions near the cart. Once the new mannequins were in place and the old ones were in the snow sled position, Square came out of the South 2 elevator fully showered. "I see you've met my right hand Alani," Square said. "Sometimes I'm both hands," Alani said as she pushed the cart towards the elevator. "Indeed," Square said. Square and George joined Alani in the elevator. Alani waved to George as her and the other staff pushed the cart off the elevator on floor 92. George and Square exited on the ground floor and caught a transport to the taco stand. On the way to the taco stand, George had a nagging thought. Was Square his real name? He thought back to yesterday's conversation with Kim. He decided to dig a bit. "So Alani tells me her name means orange tree. It made me wonder about your name. What's the meaning behind Square?" As if the question was asked 100 times a day, Square answered, "My mom was a math major with a double major in CAD in college. When she graduated, she got a job doing exocartography for the United Humans Co-op. To her, the square is the most perfect shape ever discovered. She thought I was perfect, so she named me with the perfect name, Square." George always considered the circle as perfect because it was cornerless, but before he could say it, Square stopped him. "I can tell by the look on your face you were thinking circles are more perfect. I've heard every pro-circle argument you could think of, but the circle doesn't have the complexity of a square, at least according to my mother." Based on Square's tone, George felt like he should apologize. "Sorry if the question was irritating. It seems like you get asked a lot." "I do. Don't apologize for curiosity, though. I don't mind hearing the question, but I would be lying if I said I don't get sick answering it. Sometimes I tell people my name is Jack, so I don't get asked. Nobody cares about the origin of the name Jack." The transport dropped them off near the taco stand. They started walking the remaining distance and Square lit a cigarette. This surprised George. He hadn't seen many smokers since the smoking age was raised to 30 when the tobacco companies lost the class action lawsuit. You smoke, eh? George asked. Why not? I won't be in this body forever. And I love the way the menthol feels when it hits my throat, Square said just before another drag. Didn't they ban menthol and flavored tobacco products? Well, yeah, in America, but not Mexico. It's not too hard to take a trip to Tijuana every so often and stock up. How do you get them past the border? Square's lips turned up into a slightly devious smile. I told you before, I've got my ways. By ways, do you mean Omni Logistics? George asked, remembering the green tea. You think I can't figure out how to get past some weekend warrior border guards? Square said, chuckling. The taco stand was busy as always, but not as busy as yesterday with Kim. Square took out a $50 bill saying, "My treat," and paid for the order. George wondered why everyone was treating him all of a sudden. Square grabbed their number and they headed to a table near the far edge of the seating area to get out of the range of a group of 3 obnoxiously loud men near the front. Just as they sat, George's phone notification alert chimed. In an effort to keep up on the news, George had subscribed to news alerts. It was a headline about a man getting electrocuted to death while mowing his lawn. George thought he should create conversation. Sheesh, of all things, a man got electrocuted mowing the lawn. Can you imagine getting electrocuted? What a cruel fate. Fate? Square's voice seemed elevated. You don't believe in fate, do you? The question felt aggressive to George. He, in fact, did believe in fate, but he had only meant to make conversation. He seemed to have hit a sore spot with Square. I mean, yeah, I think some people are destined to follow a certain path, he said, thinking about his own downfall from his dream of being a fighter, and that maybe certain events are determined long before they happen and can't be avoided. Square raised his eyebrows slightly, shaking his head up and down. I see. Then he balled his right hand into a fist and landed a strong blow on George's arm. George spent years fighting and training MMA, and had broken more bones than he could count, so getting punched in the arm didn't hurt, but the punch irritated him. Why would you do that? What's wrong with it? You don't see any problem with punching someone just because you disagree with them? George said, raising his voice. Not at all. That punch was determined millions of years ago. It was fate, Square said with the same devious smile earlier. George let out a heavy sigh. Look, I didn't say there wasn't free choice. I just said some things were determined. Determined? By who or what? Square asked, fixing an intense gaze on George. George thought for a second. Well, if an asteroid is headed towards Earth, we can determine whether it will hit us or miss us, can't we? Square chuckled. That's not fate, George. That's a calculation. If you had slowed down time just now and saw my fist moving in an arc towards your arm, you could have determined with reasonable accuracy that your arm was going to be struck. Square pointed to George's phone. And as far as the man mowing his lawn, I read it yesterday. If the man wasn't on a video call, he might have noticed the exposed power cable. He would be alive today. Neither observation nor the lack of it means that something is fate or that it is destined to happen. How can I win against this logic? George lost the debate, but nonetheless, he was enjoying the conversation. George decided to push further. So you're saying... A blaring voice from the overhead speaker cut George off. Number 42! Number 42! I'll get it, Square said, getting up from his table. While Square got their food, George entered fate into his phone's dictionary and read the definition. This will work. The third definition of fate in the dictionary was simply final outcome. He would argue that this was the meaning of fate instead of the deeper meaning. He was curious how Square would rebut this. George glanced up from his phone to see Square stopped near the table of 3 men that were so loud when they arrived. Square was holding the tray of food and explaining something with his usual zeal. George could hear only every word or so, but he clearly heard the words societal contract and humanity. The men all had confused looks on their faces. The larger of the men in the middle abruptly stood up and pushed the tray up into Square's chest, knocking Square to the ground. Square, covered in taco meat and sour cream, scrambled backwards to get away. The man wearing the wife-beater shirt grabbed Square's left leg, pulling him backwards towards the three men, as the men in the shirt that said, "Fuck around and find out," began kicking Square in the ribs. Fuck. George leapt from the table and within seconds was behind the large man. It had been years since he fought, but muscle memory kicked in. He wrapped his left arm around the large man's neck in a chokehold as he swept the man's legs, knocking him to the ground. The wife-beater shirt man, dumbfounded, stood there still holding Square's legs. George was determined to end this peacefully. "I don't want to fight you guys. Let go of my friend and we can forget this ever happened." Wife-beater shirt guy said, "Fuck you and your stingy friend." Fuck around and find out guy lurched towards George. George, still holding the larger man in a neck hold, reflexively rotated his right shoulder, stepping his right foot in the direction of the attack, connecting his right fist to the attacker's left eye. The cracking of the man's orbital bones sent him crashing to the concrete, grasping his face with both hands. Another MMA fighter might have been able to rebound from such a hit, but fuck around man found out just how powerful an MMA jab is. Wife-beater shirt man let go of Square's legs and Square scooted away, resting his back on a pole of the awning. Out of nowhere, the wife-beater man brandished a 3-inch knife and was swinging in rapid arcs at George's head. Dragging the large man by the neck, George successfully dodged the first 2 swings, but the third sliced him superficially on the neck. George couldn't properly defend against the knife attack without more mobility. He released the neck of the large man, shoving him down and away from his body. The wife-beater man swung again. George jumped back, raising both of his arms in defensive posture while fixing his stance for maximum stability. On the next swing, George launched his good leg into the attacker's chest and sent him flying. The man fell backwards into the concrete table behind him. His head snapped on the edge, and he fell like a ragdoll to the ground. Blood was trickling out of the now unresponsive man's ear. Square was in a daze. George grabbed his arm and pulled him up into a standing position and dragged him away from the taco stand, shouting, "Let's go." George and Square sprinted down the main road and turned into a narrow alley between the buildings. Once they were midway down the alley, which was barely wide enough for a car, George slowed down to a brisk walk. As the adrenaline of the fight dissipated, George began feeling pain in his 4th and 5th metacarpal bones. He had felt this before. They were fractured. If he were still fighting, he wouldn't be able to fight for up to 3 months depending on the severity of the fracture. George scanned the area and didn't see any cameras, but he was sure they must have been caught on multiple cameras pointed to the street. Fuck. The Digital Privacy Rights Amendment made it illegal to track the digital tracks of anyone that had opted out, but this didn't stop tracking of an active crime as long as it wasn't done using private digital data. In other words, cameras pointed to the street were fair game for the police. George had to come up with a plan. Once George was sure they weren't being watched or followed, he leaned up against the wall, taking a breath. "Are you okay?" he asked Square. "My ribs hurt, but not too bad. And I'm a bit dirty," he said, looking at the red sauce covering his shirt. "Thanks for saving me back there. How about you? You didn't break any bones, did you?" Looking down at his right hand, now beginning to swell, he said, "Nothing I haven't broke before." "Why did we run? They attacked us. It was clearly self-defense," Square said, still catching his breath. "Yes, it was self-defense, but retired or not, I'm a trained MMA fighter." "So?" Square said. It's a common myth that people trained in martial arts or boxing, etc., have to register their hands as deadly weapons. But in America, this is only true in the territory of Guam. George knew this, but his skills were still a huge liability. Even in self-defense cases, the defender could be sentenced to years in prison because of his martial arts capability. George didn't want to even think about starting his life over again. George grabbed Square by the shoulders. "Look. That man I kicked was bleeding from the ear. If he doesn't make it and the police catch up with us, I would certainly be charged with manslaughter or murder." Square said, "It was still self-defense. They had a knife. You were just standing your ground." Square was almost pleading for George to understand. "No, Square. Self-defense or not. California isn't a stand-your-ground state, and I used overwhelming force when it could be argued that I should have retreated. So you understand why we can't involve the police." Square answered, "Yes," then asked, "What's your plan?" We're going to set a false trail and hope for the best, George responded while checking behind them again. When you first met me, you said you shared my dislike of omnipresent mode. You weren't just trying to be friendly, were you? No, I have opium disabled. It's too intrusive. Good. We're going to head towards the airport international terminal, George said. You really think that's necessary? We don't need to fly anywhere. I assure you, our lawyers can handle this. We're not going anywhere. We're just creating a trail for them to follow if they end up reviewing the street side CCT cameras. Okay, so we go to the airport. Then what? George's eyes rapidly shifted left and right as he formulated a plan partially based on a recent crime story he had read. Listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you. You need to follow these steps precisely. You're going to walk to the nearest fast food restaurant and make a beeline to the bathroom. Wipe off your shirt as best as you can, then turn it inside out and put it back on. Finally, I can get my shake, Square said, chuckling. How can he fucking joke right now? George shook his head. Absolutely not. Immediately leave the restaurant and grab a cab or a transport to the international terminal at the airport. It's important that anything you buy or pay for from this point forward, you pay for in cash. I told you, I don't have opium on. They won't be tracking me. Yeah, but we can't risk anyone seeing your name on a credit terminal. Square isn't a hard name to remember. If anyone you interact with gets questioned by the police, the plan won't work if they know your name. Don't worry, I always pay in cash to avoid paying tips, Square said. Good, keep doing that. Once you're at the airport, go to the Concourse shops and buy some luggage and new clothing in cash. After that, ride a transport back to the closest bus terminal and take a bus back to the city. These are very specific instructions, George. I don't remember seeing data on you being a criminal mastermind. I'm not a criminal mastermind. I'm just an avid reader of true crime novels. Then George thought to himself that in the books he read, most of the criminals get caught. Square didn't seem assured. Won't they just see my news shirt and track me that way? Maybe 20 years ago, yes, but they legally can't track us inside the airport, George said. A provision of the DPRA made it illegal to have tracking technology, including cameras in airports, bus terminals, or any public transportation facility. For private businesses, it was still legal to have CCT cameras pointing towards the street, and this was the only thing that worried George. I think we could just go to the police. We didn't do anything wrong. My lawyers are very capable, Square said again. Why doesn't this guy get it? Look, we can do it your way with lawyers if we get caught. I'm not going to explain the logic to you again. If we are caught, I risk going to jail for manslaughter. The good news is, crime statistics are in our favor. The majority of crimes, including murders, go unsolved, and police are chronically underfunded and overwhelmed. If we're lucky, the police won't be able to identify us, and they'll move on to easier cases to solve. Square seemed to finally understand. Fair enough. I'm not going to question the man that saved my life. I owe you one. Remember, don't use your credit card, and if you have to tell someone your name, Square interrupted, I'll tell them Jack. Perfect. Just then, two men entered the alley from the direction of the taco shop. George's heart raced, but the men were deep in conversation and didn't even glance towards George and Square as they passed. George, thinking fast, looked back to Square. This is our shot. Follow those men out of the alley to the street, then go the opposite direction. George knew that most criminals who got away with committing a crime ended up getting caught by talking about their crimes later. He squeezed Square's shoulders using the palms of his hands to avoid the pain of the throbbing fingers on his right hand. If this all works out, I'll see you next Thursday at the regular time. We will never, under any circumstances, talk about this again. This never happened. Understood. Square did as George said and followed the two men out of the alley. A few minutes later, George followed another man walking the opposite direction back towards the street the taco stand was on. The man turned left, heading away from the taco stand, and George kept pace with him for 10 minutes until the man entered a convenience store. George walked a few more blocks, then hailed a transport to the airport. George had rebuilt his life from depths of despair he never wanted to visit again. If he lost Kim over some punks at a taco stand, he didn't know if he could ever rebound. Why would Square even engage those guys in conversation? The airport was a little over 10 minutes by transport from downtown. It wasn't a large airport and until a few years back just had 2 terminals. You can drop me off here. George said in front of the Japan Airlines curbside check-in. The transport stopped, and George inserted a 50 into the bill validator and took the change from the dispenser. It wasn't uncommon for auto couriers to deliver luggage to the airport separate from the passenger, so it wouldn't be strange for someone to arrive at the airport without luggage. George went up a large escalator to the third floor immediately above ticketing. The new international terminal felt more like a mall than an airport. If it weren't for the pain in George's right hand, he would have been happy to see an old-fashioned map next to the large Omni Touch map. There were 3 luggage shops in the concourse. George chose the second furthest one from his current location, assuming that Square would choose the closest or the farthest. On the way to the luggage shop, he made 2 stops. First, he stopped at the San Diego Burger Express and bought a large drink. He filled it with ice, and using a bandana he bought at the Travel Comfort Shop, he wrapped his right hand. At the luggage shop, George pulled 5 crisp $100 bills from the envelope Square gave him after the session. He purchased a large black hard-type luggage and a smaller type carry-on soft-type bag. He might as well buy something he can use later. From the souvenir shop next door, George bought an I Love San Diego shirt and put it on in the bathroom, putting his old shirt in the new carry-on bag. He hopped into a transport, directing it to the Trolley Plaza bus station. Once he arrived, he headed for a bathroom and found an empty stall. He pulled his old shirt from the carry-on bag and turned it inside out to hide the design on the front. After putting it on, he balled up the new shirt and flushed it down the toilet. As much as it felt like a waste, he decided it would be better to abandon the new bags in the station bathroom. A human-driven yellow cab had just dropped off passengers at the terminal, and George hopped in, telling the driver to take him downtown. While in the cab, George's phone chimed. It was a new headline: 28-year-old Chula Vista man dead after unprovoked attack in downtown San Diego. Are you kidding me?